Former United States career diplomat, author and businessman, Ambassador Chaz Freeman is our guest as we go one-on-one. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo and this is The Heat. Ambassador Chaz Freeman has enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a top diplomat for the United States. When U.S. President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China in 1972, Chaz Freeman was his principal American interpreter. Later, he served as Director for Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 1979 through 1981. Ambassador Freeman has a special understanding of the China-U.S. relationship. So, what does he think about the current state of China-U.S. relations? What are his views on the trade conflict between the two countries? And what about developments over the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula? He has also served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and he is currently Senior Fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to have you.
Great to have you. Before we get into the current state of U.S.-China relations, let's go back to the beginning, to that historic moment when Richard Nixon went to China, 1972. You were there. You were Nixon's interpreter. What are your recollections of that moment?
Well, it was a dramatic moment, of course, because the United States and China had been mutually isolated for 23 years, really, since 1949, and the success of the Chinese Communist Party in defeating the Kuomintang. We hadn't nearly had any contact other than through talks at the ambassadorial level in Warsaw, but those had been terminated a year or two before. So here was the President of the United States visiting the capital of a state, a government that he didn't recognize. We thought at that time our official position was there was only one China, Taiwan was part of China, and the capital was in Taipei, not in Beijing. So this was a very strange atmosphere. And China was still in the Cultural Revolution, very isolated, impoverished, a bit of a cultural desert. It's been exciting to watch it come to life since then.
What was the motivation at the time for the U.S. opening up to China?
Very simple, really. The United States had two major strategic issues of concern. One was the growth of the Soviet Union and its power. We had been using Taiwan to contain China. We wanted to use China to contain the Soviet Union. And second, of course, we were involved in war in Indochina with North Vietnam. And there was a thought that if we could establish a good rapport with the Chinese, this might put a bit of pressure on the Vietnamese to settle their issues with us.
And here we are almost 50 years later, 46 years later, after that historic moment. Looking broadly at the U.S.-China relationship today, what is your assessment?
It's a bit of a mess.
Tell us more about that.
Well, I think people on both sides, the press, have taken a long time to understand that this isn't just a trade conflict. It's much broader than that. I compare it, in fact, in geopolitical terms, to the Sino-Soviet Split. If you remember, China and the Soviet Union had an alliance briefly after World War II, and then an entente, a limited cooperation, as it became apparent that their interests were different. But by the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 60s, they had fallen out, and by the end of the 60s, were actually engaged in war along their border. And this was a geopolitical earthquake. It took the United States quite a while to accept that this was happening, but when we did, we reached out to China and basically tried to enlist Chinese cooperation to handle the Soviet threat. That had all sorts of consequences. It ultimately led to the normalization of U.S.-China relations in January 1, 1979, coincided with the Deng Xiaoping convening of the Third Plenum, which launched reform and opening. These were two parts of the same decision by him. He took a gamble with his country. He opened it to the outside world, especially to the United States. The Chinese elite promptly sent their kids here for education. And he used the United States both strategically to keep the Soviets off balance as he administered a lesson to Vietnam, and he used the United States to erase much of the Soviet system in China. So this was an exciting development, and it made sense.
We hear very often right now that the relationship between China and the United States is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. It certainly is the biggest and most important trade relationship in the world. So what's gone wrong in your view?
I don't think either side has listened adequately to the other. There is always a psychological adjustment to be made when the balances of prestige and power shift. China is restoring its wealth and power to historic levels. The United States has prospered in an environment in which China was weak and vulnerable. Now it has to deal with a China that is wealthy and strong. So there are psychological adjustments to be made to deal with this, and they're not easy. If you're used to being number one, and suddenly you're in doubt about that, you might react irrationally.
Right. And in dealing with a China that is wealthy and strong right now, you've used a term, strategic deficit. You say that the United States has a strategic deficit. Explain that to us.
Well, I think we went through 43 years of Cold War with a grand strategy that had been supplied by George Kennan called containment. And the theory behind it was that the Soviet system had so many defects that if you let it stew in its own juice, it would eventually collapse of its own defects. That 43-year period was one in which there was a bipolar international order, everything related to the U.S.-Soviet contention. We didn't have to think strategically. We got out of the habit of doing it. So now I think we have a strategy deficit. We're really not able to think in strategic terms adequately to deal with a world which is no longer bipolar, in which there are other countries like China who are now themselves poles of the new order. It's not just China, by the way. Japan is kicking off the post-war order. Russia, obviously, is quite different. The EU is attempting to become something it has so far failed to become, namely its own power center. We need to adjust to this.
We look at this current trade dispute and we hear terms being bandied around, terms like this is a new Cold War. In fact, the US Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech just a few weeks ago in which it was a very hard-hitting speech against China, and that prompted this headline from the Wall Street Journal. It said, Mike Pence announces Cold War II.
Well, I think we are headed into a period of adversarial antagonism. I think it will be a Cold War in the sense that both China and the United States will try very hard to avoid getting into an actual fight militarily. But this is more than trade. It's military, it's political, it's prestige, it's the role of the two countries in the international order. It's going to be difficult to manage, but it won't be like the Cold War. Why? The Soviet Union was autarkic. It was off in its own little corner of the world. It was not connected. China is very much part of the world, many ways more globalized than the United States. It's the biggest trading partner for many countries. So we will continue to have the kinds of relationships with China, regardless of the state of political relations, that we never had with the Soviet Union.
You say it could develop into an adversarial relationship, yet both countries have benefited so much from China's opening up over the last 40 years.
Yes, this is essentially irrational. We should not have an adversarial relationship. We can compete, of course, that's fine, but we should remember that we have many reasons to cooperate. We both need a peaceful international environment. The United States has a lot of problems it has to solve. It can't solve them in the midst of perpetual war. We need to work on planet-wide problems like climate change. That can't be addressed without both countries. I think there are improvements to be made in the way the world regulates trade and investment. There are obviously new issues like cyberspace and cyber theft and cyber security to be addressed, and these need to be done on a global basis, and you can't do them without the U.S. and China working together. So we have many reasons to cooperate. We're being diverted for the moment into a serious quarrel.
Right, because if you look at something like the current trade dispute, if you listen to what President Trump says, well, how this administration approaches it, and if you're sitting on the Chinese side, I mean, would it be fair to say that you'd be scratching your head and asking yourself, what do the Americans want?
Oh, I think that's entirely the reason why there probably won't be a negotiated resolution of this squabble. There are people on the American side who want to reduce U.S. imports to the level of U.S. exports. Why? It's hard to understand. There are people who are concerned about military technology and the exchange of it. There are people who are concerned about the pace and origin of innovation technologically and believe the way to handle that is to restrict the flow of technology. There are other people who want to open the financial sector in China. There's some who basically just want to halt China's rise. So there is a complete congeries of incompatible demands on the American side that, you know, if you were to actually resolve one of these, the people who espouse the others would not accept that. So it's just, I don't think there is going to be an early or satisfactory negotiated resolution of this. In time, however, there will be, because we need each other, and we can't get on without each other.
Is it also a problem that President Trump tends to see this as a zero-sum game, is that there's got to be a winner on one side and a loser on the other side?
That's his style. He is actually a mercantilist, concerned with bilateral trade balances and government direction of them, and a very anti-globalist in his reasoning. I think he's quite isolated on that in terms of the views of the American elite. But he can do a lot of damage while he's in office. And I go back to my original statement that I don't think each side listened sufficiently to the other. There have been complaints by the American business community, by American politicians, by others about Chinese behavior in the trade and investment area, which have gone unaddressed. And I think China underestimated the degree of frustration that was building toward exasperation on the American side. I don't think the United States has listened to the Chinese. There are ample reasons for China to do many of the things that it is doing, and the question is not whether they should do them or not. I'm thinking, for example, of the Made in China 2025 drive, for example. It's not whether China should do that or not, it's how it does it that matters. That's something we ought to be talking about, instead of simply condemning the whole program.
Because China has a right to develop its technology if it wants to, as it sees fit, doesn't it?
It would be good for everyone if it did. I mean, historically, China was a major contributor to the science and technology in the world, everything from paper to the compass, gunpowder, if that's an advance, and many other things, the first oil drilling done in China. And for China to restore itself as a contributor to global science, technology, and prosperity is a very good thing, not a bad thing.
Well, let's look at some other areas where China and the United States have interests. The Korean Peninsula, efforts there to persuade the DPRK to get rid of its nuclear weapons. Are you encouraged by developments?
I think things are going in an interesting direction which might resolve this issue. And this is because South and North Korea are trying very hard, it appears, to end their conflict. And if they can make peace with each other on the Korean Peninsula, then there will be no need for nuclear weapons on the part of North Korea. There are also the U.S. presence in South Korea militarily will be adjusted somehow by mutual agreement. The general security of Northeast Asia will be improved. There's a difference of opinion. I think the American side wants the nuclear issue to be resolved first and then to get at the question of peace. The Koreans, both North and South apparently, and I think China, see the process as starting with peace and ending with the elimination of these weapons.
But no matter how that process goes, it will have to be ultimately buttressed by support and agreement by both the United States and China.
The United States and China fought a war in Korea over the question of the order in Korea. China sacrificed a great deal to preserve a buffer state in the form of North Korea. The United States also sacrificed for our own principles and as part of containment strategy. We're part of the history. We can't escape that. If there is to be peace in Korea, there must be peace between China and the United States as well as between North and South Korea on that issue. We both have relationships now with both of the Koreas, and it's our responsibility, I think, to exercise whatever influence we have to ensure that Korea becomes free of nuclear weapons.
Looking at U.S. policy in that region, the previous administration, the Obama administration, adopted a policy known as the pivot to Asia. Now, you've been critical of that policy. Why?
First of all, I didn't think it had any resources behind it. Second, I saw it as a military response to essentially an economic problem. The economic problem, or maybe not a problem, but economic trend, was the building of a China-centered order in East Asia, economically. This is because of supply chain economics. It's because of China's natural size and influence in the region. It's because of Chinese prosperity, which has caused other countries to prosper. You can't answer if this trend is somehow adverse, which I don't really think it is. You can't answer it with military moves. Similarly, I think the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially an exercise in geoeconomics, can't be responded to effectively militarily. And to consider it as a security issue is to make a mistake. If China is able to work with others to connect Europe to East Asia and South Asia to North Asia, that should benefit everyone. Americans should be in there working together with others on that and trying to take advantage of it, to leverage Eurasian prosperity to our own advantage, not thinking up military ways to counter something that isn't military.
I just want to ask you about one other security issue in the region, and that is the South China Sea. It's bubbling up again. Does the United States have a fundamental misunderstanding of why China thinks that it has an important role in that part of the world?
Well, we're talking past each other for sure. The United States is talking about a very limited aspect of freedom of navigation, which is the right of warships to exercise innocent passage from point A to point B, even when that goes through the territorial waters of another country. This is something that China does not accept, even though it is part of the Law of the Sea Treaty, which ironically the United States has not ratified, but China has. Still, the Chinese, on the Chinese side, there are memories of invasion from this very sea by European imperialists. There are also claims that for a long time were inert, nobody was doing anything about them, between different countries, China, meaning both Beijing and Taipei
right.
on one side, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia on the other side. Nobody did anything about these until basically the 80s, when the others moved to establish outposts in islands. China's playing a game of weiqi or go. Let's put some markers down. You other claimants, we're here and you're not going to be able to throw us out. You're going to have to deal with our claim. This is also part of a Chinese defense perimeter. It's not unreasonable for China to want to have early warning of potential attack, or to consider the need to protect freedom of navigation for commercial shipping. 2/3 of the commercial shipping through there is Chinese, meaning it's going to or from China, not necessarily in Chinese ships. The country that is most concerned about this in the normal sense is China, not the United States. China should be cooperating with the United States. The United States should be cooperating with China to protect that shipping. Instead, we're engaged in quarrels over, sovereignty over little fly specks in a large sea. Now, I think the Chinese have not handled this terribly well, and the United States hasn't, I admit. But China's left its position unclear. If you leave a position unclear, people then feel free to assume the worst. And generally, the world outside China has.
Right.
China needs to clarify its position, in my view.
If we look broadly now at the role that China and the United States plays in the world right now, the United States has benefited greatly from the post-World War II order. It helped create many of the institutions that has kept the peace, that has aided development throughout the world. But now it talks of withdrawal, of America first, of protectionism. We heard a speech at the United Nations just a few weeks ago in which President Trump was very critical about the idea of multilateralism. He talked about patriotism. As this happens, do you see China stepping into the breach here and playing a bigger role in world affairs?
Well, I think China is inevitably going to play a bigger role in world affairs, given its size, its dynamism, the extent to which it is now connected to every country in the world. So that is an inevitability. The question is how. I would say that China has prospered greatly and benefited from the American-created order, from which the United States now appears to be withdrawing. It's in China's interest actually to preserve that order. If the United States chooses to leave it behind, it would make sense for China to get together with other countries to ensure that it's preserved without the United States. And I suspect that may happen. We've seen already China work with others to create institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which supplements the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, or the so-called new bank, the BRICS Bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank on a global scale. Many funds that have been established to support the Belt and Road Initiative also take the existing rules, actually improve them a bit, and create parallel structures that are free of obstruction from others. Unfortunately, in some cases, the United States has been obstructionist and has not been willing to adjust these institutions, let's say World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, had not been willing to adjust them to take account of the fact that global power is now in a different constellation. Things are changing. I think this is not wise on our part, and I think the examples I cited, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the new bank, are likely harbingers of the future, in which if the United States will not adjust, others will find workarounds that enable them to perpetuate what the United States created after World War II, which basically everybody likes, except apparently this administration in Washington.
You say the world order is changing, and I'm wondering to that extent, how important is the kind of one-on-one diplomacy, the personal diplomacy that we saw between Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong, or President Carter and Deng Xiaoping? We know that President Trump, he tells us, he enjoys a good personal relationship with President Xi Jinping. Would you recommend more direct talks? How do they nurture that? How do they exploit that?
I think personal relationships between leaders are important because in the end, decisions, although they may be formulated at the bottom, have to be approved at the top. In an orderly system, those decisions are studied and tweaked and adjusted, and they come in the end to the president or to the general secretary of the Communist Party in China. So this is important, but it is no substitute for strong engaged lower levels. What is lacking at the moment? There is, to my knowledge, in the U.S. government at present, almost no one with government experience dealing with China. Almost no one who speaks Chinese. This despite the fact that there's a whole new generation in the United States of people who are comfortable speaking and reading and writing Chinese and who've spent time in China. On the Chinese side, the expertise about the United States has constantly grown, and it's being put to good use. On our side, I'm sorry, we have been seized by nativist, maybe xenophobic elements, and who have very strange ideas about China, based on no direct experience of their own. So we need both. We need the good personal relationship at the top. We need strong governance below. We need bureaucracies and scientific establishments that are engaged with each other and that understand each other.
Looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest risks in this relationship between China and the United States?
The relationship overall is bad at the moment. The atmosphere is bad. There's no mutual trust. There's not much communication of a constructive nature going on at the level of government. There's a great deal going on at the private level or between individuals. This is a bad context for issues that are explosive, like the Taiwan issue, the South China Sea issue, or the Senkaku or Diaoyu issue between China and Japan. The United States is in the position of having committed to back Japan if there's a conflict with China over that Senkaku dispute. This means that a mistake on the part of Mr. Abe can get the United States into a war. That's a little dangerous. China at least has control of its own forces. It's not the prisoner of some third party. South China Sea is similar. The United States is essentially on the side of the other claimants, not China. There could be an incident. We're playing chicken on the seas with the Chinese Navy. There could be an accident. And of course, Taiwan is pretty much adrift with a government in Taipei that is not interested in following the One China principle or reunification, and a breakdown in cross-strait communication, plus misunderstanding between the United States and China. If Taiwan and the mainland get into some sort of fight, that could easily escalate. And we're talking about a war between two nuclear powers. We're not talking about China before 1964. So I think the worst that could happen would be that we stumble into a war that neither side wants, and that ultimately could prove catastrophic for both.
Indeed, a big risk. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.